25 years of marriage, high school sweethearts who seemed absolutely perfect, according to their daughter. Todd and Barbara Kendhammer appeared ridiculously in love. She decorated her school cafeteria workstation with family photos and flowers, testament to their beautiful life on their rural Wisconsin farm. But on a quiet country road outside West Salem, this perfect marriage would be shattered by a story so bizarre, so unbelievable, it would fool investigators, devastate a family, and leave a community questioning everything they thought they knew about true love. On Friday morning, September 16, 2016, at 8:09 a.m., a frantic 911 call pierced through the emergency dispatch center in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. The terror in Todd Kendhammer's voice was unmistakable. "A pipe or something came through the windshield," he gasped, his words barely comprehensible through overwhelming shock and grief. His wife Barbara had been hit and was bleeding, unresponsive, dying. According to Todd, they were driving down County Highway M when the unthinkable happened. A 10.5-pound metal pipe had fallen from an oncoming truck, crashed through their Toyota Camry's windshield, and struck Barbara with devastating force. When first responders arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. The gray Camry sat in a shallow ditch, a jagged pipe protruding through the shattered windshield, like a spear. Barbara slumped in the passenger seat, her travel mug on the floor. Todd knelt outside, covered in cuts and bruises, claiming he had removed the pipe to administer CPR. It looked like a horrific accident, a freak occurrence no one could have predicted. But sometimes, the most tragic stories are the most carefully constructed lies. Barbara Lynn Kendhammer was born on March 21, 1970, the kind of woman who brought sunshine and roses to every room she entered. Her co-workers at the local middle school cafeteria knew her as cheerful and caring, someone who would light up even the most ordinary day with her warmth. It was as teenagers that Barbara met Todd Allen Kendhammer, born December 8, 1969. Their romance began in classic small-town fashion, two young people falling deeply in love in rural Wisconsin. From the moment they met, they were inseparable, building a relationship so strong that friends would later describe them as almost ridiculously in love. They married young, just 21 years old, and by 2016 had quietly marked their 25th wedding anniversary. Together, they had built what appeared to be an idyllic life on a rural plot outside West Salem. Todd worked as a circuit attachment operator at Crown, Cork and Seal, a local metal can plant, while also running a side business doing automobile glass repair. Barbara worked part-time in the school cafeteria, her flexible hours allowing her to coordinate with Todd's schedule so she could ride along on early morning errands. The couple had two children, Jessica and Jordan, who grew up seeing their parents as the embodiment of true love. Daughter Jessica would later testify that their parents' marriage was absolutely perfect. A union without cracks, without conflict, without the typical struggles that plague so many relationships. By all accounts, the Kendhammers were thriving in 2016. They were planning to buy the 80-acre farm property where they lived. Todd built houses with Barbara as a side project, and together they managed household tasks and odd jobs in lieu of any typical office routine. They had recently become grandparents, with Jessica having just become a new mother. The children insisted their parents were in a really good time in their lives, and were even well off financially. What seemed like the perfect American dream was about to become a perfect nightmare. But the tragedy that would shatter this family wasn't an accident at all. It was something far more sinister, hiding in plain sight within the walls of what everyone believed was a loving home. The morning of September 16, 2016, dawned overcast and ordinary in rural La Crosse County. At around 7:30 a.m., Todd and Barbara Kendhammer climbed into their gray Toyota Camry and headed north on County Highway M toward Hamilton. Barbara was due at her job at the school cafeteria that morning, but first, Todd had told her they needed to pick up a friend's pickup truck for a windshield repair, the kind of side work that supplemented their comfortable middle-class income. A surveillance camera at a nearby farm captured their Camry rolling past at exactly 7:57 a.m. In the footage, everything appeared normal, just a married couple running an early morning errand together, as they had done countless times over their 25 years of marriage. But just minutes later, their world would explode into chaos. At 8:09 a.m., Todd Kendhammer frantically dialed 911. His voice was tense, distraught, filled with what sounded like genuine terror. "A pipe or something came through the windshield," he told the dispatcher. Barbara had been hit. She was bleeding. She was dying. Todd's story was as specific as it was shocking. He claimed that as they drove along County Highway M, a heavy metal pipe had fallen from an oncoming flatbed truck. The pipe, he said, had flown through the air like a missile, smashing through the passenger side of their windshield and striking Barbara directly in the head and throat with devastating force. According to Todd, the impact was so severe that Barbara immediately lost consciousness. Blood poured from her wounds as Todd claimed he pulled over, removed the pipe from the car, and desperately attempted CPR while calling for help. His story painted a picture of a devoted husband fighting to save the woman he loved, a man traumatized by witnessing the most horrific accident imaginable. When deputies arrived at the scene within minutes of the call, they found exactly what Todd had described. The Camry sat off the right shoulder of Burgham Cooley Road, its right front wheel resting in a shallow ditch. The windshield was indeed shattered, with a jagged hole where the pipe had allegedly penetrated. Barbara was slumped unconscious in the passenger seat, her injuries severe and life-threatening. Todd himself bore the marks of the incident, cuts and bruises on his knuckles, neck, and torso, which he explained were from instinctively punching the windshield and handling broken glass in his desperate attempt to help his wife. A heavy metal pipe lay nearby, the alleged weapon that had turned a routine morning drive into a scene of devastation. Paramedics worked quickly, lifting Barbara onto a stretcher and rushing her by ambulance to Gunderson Health System in La Crosse. Todd, visibly shaken and cooperative, gave investigators his account of the morning's events. He insisted throughout that the crash was a freak accident, explaining each detail with the precision of someone who had lived through trauma. How the pipe had flew off a truck at high speed, how he had punched the glass in reaction, how he had pulled the pipe out to aid Barbara. But even as Todd painted his picture of a tragic accident, strange details began to emerge. Despite the alleged truck losing such a large piece of cargo on a public road, no other vehicles or witnesses were immediately apparent. A resident driving past the crash shortly after the accident reported seeing the Camry in the ditch, but with its windshield appearing unbroken and no one outside the vehicle. More puzzling was the surveillance footage. The same camera that had captured the Kendhammers' car at 7:57 a.m. showed no large truck on the road at that time, no oncoming flatbed, no vehicle that could have been responsible for the flying pipe that Todd claimed had destroyed their lives. As the day wore on, investigators combed the area for debris, skid marks, or any evidence that might support Todd's version of events. They found none. Despite extensive searches and public appeals for witnesses, no one could locate the mysterious truck or its driver. In a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business, a truck losing a massive pipe on a public road should have been noticed, reported, remembered by someone. But Barbara's medical crisis took precedence over these puzzling inconsistencies. Emergency surgeons operated through the afternoon and into the evening, with Todd and the children keeping vigil at her bedside. Tragically, despite the medical team's heroic efforts, Barbara never regained consciousness. In the early hours of September 17, 2016, Barbara Kendhammer lost her fight for life. She was 46 years old, a devoted wife, loving mother, and cherished grandmother whose life had been cut short in what appeared to be the most tragic of circumstances. But as investigators would soon discover, Barbara's death was not the result of a freak accident. It was something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated murder that had been staged to look like tragedy, carried out by the very person who should have protected her most. What began as an accident investigation quickly transformed into something far more complex and disturbing. As La Crosse County Sheriff's Department investigators examined the evidence more closely, Todd Kendhammer's story began to unravel like a carefully woven tapestry coming apart at the seams. The first major red flag came from the physics of the alleged accident. Investigators brought in accident reconstruction experts to analyze whether Todd's story was even possible. Could a pipe really fall from a truck, crash through a windshield, and cause the specific pattern of damage they observed? The experts were skeptical from the beginning. The trajectory analysis revealed problems with Todd's account. The angle of the windshield damage suggested the pipe had struck from an unusual direction, not one consistent with falling from a moving truck traveling in the opposite direction. The force and pattern of impact didn't match what would be expected from Todd's described scenario. But the most damning evidence came from the forensic analysis of the scene itself. Investigators discovered that the spread of glass particles on the passenger seat indicated it was empty at the time the windshield was broken. If Barbara had been sitting there when the pipe crashed through, As Todd claimed, the glass should have been under her body, not spread evenly across an empty seat. The blood evidence told an even more disturbing story. Crime scene analysts found that blood drip and flow patterns revealed Barbara had been bleeding for a period of time in the passenger seat. More shocking still, the evidence showed that at one point Barbara's body had been positioned over the center console and passenger side floor, suggesting she had been moved after sustaining her injuries. This was devastating evidence that contradicted every aspect of Todd's story. If the incident had happened exactly as he described, with Barbara sitting peacefully in the passenger seat when the pipe struck, none of these forensic findings should have existed. The medical evidence was equally damning. Dr. Kathleen McCubbin, the medical examiner who performed Barbara's autopsy, found that her cause of death was due to blunt impact injuries of her head and neck, but the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with being struck by a pipe through a windshield. Barbara's autopsy revealed a horrifying catalog of violence. 3 deep lacerations on the back of her head, a fractured nose and skull, extensive bruising throughout her body, and neck trauma with muscle hemorrhaging consistent with strangulation. The injuries suggested she had been beaten repeatedly and brutally, not struck once by a flying pipe. Perhaps most telling of all, the medical examiner found no glass fragments in Barbara's wounds. If she had been struck by a pipe that had just crashed through a windshield, she should have been covered in glass particles. Their absence suggested that whatever had happened to Barbara had occurred away from the broken windshield before the scene was staged. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more inconsistencies in Todd's account. His story kept changing in small but significant ways. Details about their destination, the purpose of their trip, and the sequence of events shifted and evolved with each telling. For someone who had supposedly witnessed a traumatic accident, Todd's memory seemed remarkably unreliable. The investigation also revealed that despite extensive efforts to locate the truck Todd described, no such vehicle could be found. In a case built on the existence of this phantom truck, its absence was perhaps the most telling evidence of all. Investigators appealed to the public for witnesses, searched traffic cameras, and followed every possible lead. The truck that should have been the key to understanding Barbara's death simply didn't exist. As investigators peeled back the layers of the Kendemmer marriage, they discovered something that shocked everyone who knew the couple. By all accounts, from family, friends, neighbors, and co-workers, Todd and Barbara's relationship was genuinely loving and stable. This wasn't a case where investigators could point to a history of domestic violence, financial troubles, or marital discord. There were no police reports, no restraining orders, no documented fights. Neighbors had never heard arguments. Friends described them as devoted to each other. Even their own children vehemently defended their father, insisting he would never harm their mother. The prosecutor would later acknowledge that there was no history of domestic violence or financial trouble in the Kendhammer marriage. By all measures, they were a comfortable middle-class family with no apparent motive for murder. They owned their home, were planning to acquire more farmland, and had recently become grandparents. Their daughter Jessica told investigators they were doing really well and were even well off financially. This absence of obvious motive made the case even more puzzling and disturbing. If Todd had indeed murdered Barbara, why? What could have driven a man with no history of violence to brutally kill the woman he had supposedly loved for 25 years? The answer, investigators would conclude, might lie not in what was visible to the outside world, but in what was hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. Sometimes the most dangerous relationships are those that appear the most normal from the outside, where control and manipulation masquerade as love and devotion. But even as investigators became convinced that Todd was responsible for Barbara's death, they struggled to understand what could have motivated such a brutal act. The only record of violence in the Kendhammer marriage was documented in Barbara's autopsy report. The horrifying injuries that told the story of her final moments. Injuries that matched no accident but spoke of deliberate, sustained brutality. As the evidence mounted, investigators became convinced that Todd Kendhammer had murdered his wife and staged an elaborate accident to cover up his crime. The case they built was methodical, scientific, and devastating in its implications. The prosecution's theory was as straightforward as it was chilling. Todd had beaten Barbara to death, possibly during a domestic dispute that no one else had witnessed, and then carefully staged the scene to make it look like a freak accident. He had broken the windshield himself, positioned the pipe, and then called 911 with a fabricated story designed to make him appear as a grieving victim rather than a calculating killer. The evidence supporting this theory was overwhelming. The blood spatter analysis proved Barbara had been moved after sustaining her injuries. The glass particle evidence proved the passenger seat was empty when the windshield was broken. The medical examiner's findings proved Barbara's injuries were inconsistent with being struck by a pipe through a windshield. The physics analysis proved the alleged accident was impossible given the described circumstances. But perhaps most damning was the complete absence of the truck that was supposedly responsible for the accident. Despite extensive investigation, no evidence was ever found that such a vehicle existed. No witnesses saw it, no cameras captured it, no debris was left behind. In a case that hinged entirely on the existence of this phantom truck, its absence spoke louder than any other piece of evidence. Prosecutor Tim Grenke would argue that Todd's story was simply preposterous. The theory was that Todd had used the pipe himself to create the hole in the windshield, staging the entire scene after killing his wife. The level of premeditation required for such elaborate staging was particularly disturbing. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated murder followed by an equally calculated cover-up. The staging itself revealed a chilling attention to detail. Todd had thought about the blood evidence, the positioning of the body, the story he would tell investigators. He had inflicted injuries on himself to support his version of events. He had even considered how to explain away inconsistencies in his account by claiming trauma and shock. It was the work of someone who had considered every angle, every detail that might give him away, and it almost worked. On December 5, 2017, Todd Kendhammer went on trial for first-degree intentional homicide. The defense argued he was a traumatized widower whose story inconsistencies stemmed from shock and grief. They brought experts to challenge the prosecution's accident reconstruction and blood spatter analysis. Todd testified in his own defense, maintaining his story about the pipe accident while driving to meet Jerry logging. But the prosecution systematically dismantled his account, showing how blood evidence proved Barbara was moved after injury. Glass particles proved the passenger seat was empty when the windshield broke, and medical evidence contradicted his story. Most damaging was that no truck matching Todd's description was ever found. On December 15, 2017, Todd Kendhammer was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. In March 2018, he was sentenced to life in prison with possibility of supervision after 30 years. The verdict devastated the West Salem community and Barbara's children, Jessica and Jordan, who had defended their father throughout the trial. They now faced the reality that their hero was their mother's killer. Todd continues maintaining his innocence, with appeals consistently denied. His latest motion for post-conviction relief was rejected in May 2023. But questions remain that may never be answered. What drove a man with no apparent history of violence to brutally murder the woman he had supposedly loved for 25 years? What happened in those final moments between Todd and Barbara that led to such a savage attack? And perhaps most haunting of all, how long had Todd been capable of such violence, hidden beneath the facade of a perfect marriage?